Was France's worst terror attack in recent memory a turning point? 2 years on, commemorations to remember the 130 killed, along with the survivors of the shootings at the Bataclan concert hall, the National Stadium, and the terraces of right bank cafés taking place this Monday. The new normal, 2 years on, includes beefed-up anti-terror laws, the rout of jihadists on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria, where the Paris attacks were commandeered. Now, ISIS may be on the run, but are we any better when it comes to counter-radicalization? After the commemorations, the French president in northern France this Monday to talk jobs and ways to strengthen the social fabric in working-class places that, well, feel forgotten by Paris. But is that feeling of alienation sufficient? It only goes so far in explaining why a tiny but determined fringe would want to turn on the population of its own country in a year that's seen attacks most notably in Manchester, London, Barcelona, most recently New York. Are we any the wiser as to what to do? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what we've learned 2 years after the Paris attacks. With us, Guillaume Denoy de Saint-Marc, founder and president of the French Association for the Victims of Terrorism. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Also joining us, human rights attorney Asif Arif, co-author of France-Belgium, The Terror Connection. Nice to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
From Brussels, Ricardo Dugula, senior analyst at risk consultants Drum Cusack. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me.
On Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, 130 killed, 90 of them at the Bataclan on November the 13th, 2015. This Monday's ceremonies, including a hug between the President of the French Republic and Jesse Hughes, lead singer of the Eagles of Death metal. He was on stage when the carnage began.
My heart is still breaking.
No, my heart is here, and I love this place. The French people have really made it possible for us to come back to life. So thank you very much.
Thanks for being here and thanks for all these young people.
Well, I love this country very much. It's been good to me.
See, we're here for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Guillaume Denoy de Saint-Marc, you were on hand for that commemoration, which was then followed by a surprise concert by Jesse Hughes and his lead guitarist. 2 years. What are the thoughts of the people that were there? We saw people crying in the audience.
Yeah, it was a turning point. The first anniversary was very difficult. This one was easier. Many of the victims went over getting out of the victimized position and getting back to life and humanity. But still, it's a process that takes time. It was much easier this year than it was last year. Many of the victims didn't want to come because they knew that it would be difficult. Other ones would have come anyway, and they came, even if it was difficult. It's the beginning, it's a step forward to go in the future. And it's necessary that these steps forward, we have to be close to them, because the social contract have been broken since the attack, and now we're trying to rebuild this contract with them as a society, as also it's important that the president is there, because the target is the states and the society. So we need to rebuild confidence between the victims, the society, and the state.
Let's just remind viewers of the timeline, because there'd been the attacks in January against the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo. There was that big demonstration, January 11th of 2015, that hashtag Je suis Charlie, which some didn't quite subscribe to, most did, and there was a debate about that. In November, when it's people sitting on cafe terraces, that was different somehow.
It was different because before, the population thought the target was the policemen, were the soldiers, were the Jews as a community, were the journalists, and suddenly it could be anybody. And that was really a turning point where everybody could, everybody was trying to get away from terrorism. Say, I'm not concerned. I'm not the target. But after the 13th of November, anybody could be a target, and it was shown also in Nice afterwards during the fire with the Bastille Day attack, where and kids were targeted. Everybody was targeted, not only a category or persons among the society.
November 13th, 2 years ago, and it's still very much an active investigation. Alan Gainsford has more on that.
On the 13th of November 2015, a series of unprecedented coordinated attacks took place across Paris. Salah Abdeslam is the only surviving suspect who took part in the events of that evening.
He's the only one who was there at the scene of the attacks, the only one still alive who was there. That's why he's the key figure in the investigation. He organized the attacks, he played a bigger role than we first thought, and he was there when they took place.
After 4 months on the run, Abdeslam was arrested in March 2016 in Brussels, then extradited to France a month later. Detained since then, he's refusing to cooperate with the French authorities. Altogether, investigators have succeeded in identifying 15 suspects connected to the attacks. 7 are detained in France, 5 in Belgium, 1 in Turkey. 2 others are still at large. Authorities have uncovered the workings of the jihadist cell.
Our investigation has revealed which of the suspects went to Syria, how they returned to Europe in the summer of 2015. We have detailed information on the logistics, the connections between these people, the jihadist cells and the hideouts.
Authorities are now concentrating on finding all the financial backers of the attack and the network that enabled firearms to be transported to Paris. The investigation is expected to continue until 2019, while the trials of the suspects will take place after its completion.
Ricardo Dugulin, that interview with the Paris prosecutor on Friday, serving as a stark reminder that, well, we're still learning a lot about what happened. You remember at the outset, everybody said there was this young man who'd hidden out in the bushes who was branded the mastermind. He was killed a few days later in a shootout in a northern suburb of Paris. Turns out he wasn't the mastermind at all.
Yeah, so what we see is that the Paris attack in November were a transnational plot in which the militants who perpetrated them were acting from a command and control structure that was based in the Middle East. And that was something that was specific to the terrorist threat in Europe at that point in time, when the Islamic State had the capacity to train and disperse militants from Syria and Iraq toward Western Europe. That is something that is changing now. That is changing because of the military defeats that the Islamic State has suffered in the last few months in Syria and Iraq. And the terrorist threat now it's evolving and becoming very Europe-centric. So the Islamic State still has the intention of carrying out these attacks, maybe on a different scale, we're using different tactics, but the point is that the cells, the militants planning those operations are now increasingly based in Western Europe, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, instead of being controlled from Syria and Iraq.
Instead of being controlled from Syria and Iraq, we saw in that report how they're tracking the financial backers. What are you expecting to find out from that?
Well, knowing the financials concerning an attack is especially important for understanding all the line of command and all the line of the structure of the operation. And this is going to be instrumental in seeing who was the final person deciding on the targets and on the people being used, on the transportation means. That's extremely important to see the channels that had been used in the November attacks. And when we look at more recent attacks in France and Belgium and other places in Europe, the financials and the structure of the command and control structure is smaller in the sense that the militants were recruited within the European countries instead of coming from abroad, so as foreign fighters from Syria and Iraq, and the financing lines are tighter. And so this is something that is important to understand the evolution of the Islamic State strategy in regard to their European campaign.
I want to introduce at this point another guest from the United States, Varian Khan, editorial director at the Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium, TRAC. Thank you for being with us here on France 24. We've just heard there Ricardo Dugulin mention how this operation, masterminded from Syria, most probably, is something that, well, you won't see as much in the future because ISIS, of course, has lost that territory there. The nature of these networks is evolving. It's becoming perhaps more localized. Now, your job is essentially to monitor the chatter between jihadists. Is that something that you've witnessed?
Yes, but I think that it's a little too soon to say that something like this wouldn't happen again. You must understand that even though they've lost a lot of territory in the Sham, they still operate very functional training camps in Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, Philippines. So, I mean, if any one of those particular smaller ones decide that they want to have transnational operations, they too can do exactly what Islamic State did from the Sham.
Let me bring in Azif Arif on this. The operations that the Paris attacks, there was, of course, the subsidiary attack, which happened in Brussels when police were starting to close in on the where a lot of the Paris attackers had been hiding out in the Molenbeek district of the Belgian capital. We're now getting reports that they are perhaps plotting an attack on Amsterdam. Your thoughts on the way that these networks have evolved since then?
I mean, the previous intervenant has put this into perspective. The movement is becoming really European-centered. So my thought is actually we cannot say where they're going to attack or where they're going to move this time, because you cannot track back where they are coming from. Even we have some thoughts that Daesh is organizing it, or Daesh is losing some territory in Iraq and in Syria, but still the command is coming from somewhere, and unless we didn't localize this somewhere, we cannot say where this movement going to attack.
So you agree that there is a top-down structure that's this is, because at first, every time there's one of these attacks, first we're told it's lone wolf, and then it turns out, of course,
no,
not.
I definitely think there was a commando who was attacking. There was an organized structure who was perpetrating this attack. Of course, if you put in perspective with what happened with Charlie Hebdo or what happened with Mohamed Merah, this is where you can find this lone wolf or not lone wolf. Even for Mohamed Merah, we were thinking he's acting alone, but in fact, he has a couple of other person who was helping him. And I think you have to wait a couple of years for the investigation to go on in order to understand what is the global structure. And of course, there is always a structure.
There's always a structure.
Yeah, at least an ideological structure, because that's as a minimum. But every time we go on investigation, there is more than that. There is all sort of person helping, pushing the person forward. And we have a problem because, and that's what we could see with the Merah trial, is that
Mohamed Merah, the 2012 Toulouse shooter.
Yeah, it's that the brother who was the ideologist, who was the person who, I would say, gave the weapon to the one who shooted, cannot be convicted for complicity. Which for us is a problem because it's not a normal crime. It's a terrorist crime, and the ideology is part of the terrorist attack.
Now, that verdict came in last week, and there was a jury of magistrates who said the problem is there just wasn't the hard evidence.
The evidence is not about how there were complicity between the two and how the ideology was shared and how one of the brother gave all the ideology for the second one to act. The problem is the ideologists knew that there would be a shooting on that day, on that target. This has not been proved. But of course, he has been convinced for association de malfaiteurs, but that means he was part of the group. Yeah, but we cannot really, for the moment, but there is an appeal on it.
So for you, this sentence, which was, he was sentenced to a heavy prison
the
sentence,
heaviest he could,
30 years, but he didn't get convicted of accessory to terror act, and you're saying that the sentence is not hard enough.
No, it doesn't mean that. It means that if we want to fight terrorism, we also have to fight the ideologists, and it's a fight against persons who have a vision of the world that is not compatible with ours. We have to fight against them on everywhere. It can be by speaking, by acting, but also every time that they bring persons to murders, they have to bring complicity, because this ideology is not compatible with all the normal human beings.
Ricardo Dugulin, the number of people who subscribe to this radical ideology, would you say it's the same as it was 2 years ago? It's gone up, decreased?
I think the person who spoke before me made an excellent point, and the number of persons who abide by these ideologies, so the general radical Islamist ideology proposed by ISIS, is growing. We see that the numbers monitored by the police and internal intelligence services in France, in the UK, in Belgium, these numbers are growing. One, because the definition of a potential suspect has evolved over time. So this is one reason why these numbers are evolving. This includes as well people responsible of online propaganda. So that's one reason why the volume is increasing. But as well because terrorist attacks such as the November one in Paris generate willing by some suspects, some militants, a small number of them to emulate these kind of things. So we see that the risk generated by this portion of the population is quite high. And the problem is that this trend is likely to increase in the coming years. And just a point on this is that we need to see that the core difference between ISIS and other terrorist groups that try to do the same things is that ISIS, the core strategy of ISIS is developing an ideology that is easily accessible and very present on the cyberspace.
Easily accessible, and when we come back, when we come back, we'll be talking about more about how to counter that ideology. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.